Okay, so our next speaker is Jane Cogan. Jane grew up in Texas and moved to Seattle in 1977 with her husband Tom to work for Boeing, where she was an engineer for over 30 years. She retired in 2010 with the hope of making San Juan Island their full-time home, and so far we're lucky that that's panned out. With her passion for the southern resident killer whale, she began volunteering with the Center for Whale Research on various data-related projects. And in 2013, she took on the monumental task of compiling sightings data on all large cetaceans in the Salish Sea. Jane Cogan.
I have to say it's both humbling and intimidating to be here this morning. This is a celebration of science, and here I am, representative of the engineering community.
Can you hold the microphone closer?
Yes. I'm neither a scientist nor a researcher nor a marine mammal expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I have been working on a lot of data-related projects for the Center for Whale Research in recent years. So this morning, in the spirit of engineering, I've brought quite a few graphs, but I hope you can see that the graphs tell a story. I hope you don't find them intimidating. So the topic of the presentation is the changing landscape in the area. We're going to talk about the declining presence of the southern resident killer whales and what has historically been the core summer habitat. This parallels, it's a remarkably similar trend to what we're seeing in the abundance of Chinook salmon on the Fraser River. There's been a lot of talk about breaching dams on the Snake to help these whales, but we can't forget how important the Fraser River has been to them for decades. Also talk a little bit about coastwide Chinook salmon runs. In the interest of time, there's only a few points I can make for those. And on a happier note, the transient killer whales are taking over. They're not only being seen here on more days than ever before, but just in the last 8 months, they've brought 8 new calves into the area. And this is just the families that visit this region. It doesn't count all of the ones that we don't see. I don't really know what Jared Towers' data says for the whole transient population, the West Coast transient population. See if I can get the laser pointer over here. Okay. Let's switch to my remote. So this is a map of critical habitat here, and it includes both the Canadian regions, Canadian waters, and U.S. waters. Basically, it spans from west to east, the western entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and on the eastern end, the Rosario Strait, and Hidalgo Head, Anacortes kind of an area. And then north to south, it runs from Vancouver down to the lower end of the Seattle area. And the area in the circle there is really what we call the core summer habitat. It's the area surrounding the San Juan Islands, runs up to the Fraser River, also includes Rosario Strait. In my corporate world, experience was learning to broaden your perspective, and in particular to learn to see yourself and your work and your contributions from the perspective of your customers. And it didn't matter if your customers were your immediate managers or people in another part of the company or the people who were buying your products. It's also important to have metrics in place so you knew if your program was on track and whether or not the things you were doing were going to satisfy your customers. So in the whale world, if we pretend the whales are the customers of this critical habitat designation, now what metrics can we use to grade whether or not our stewardship of this environment is really meeting the needs of the whales? There's a lot of focus on noise and motor pressure on the whales and other venues. I'm not going to go into that today, but the focus here is on attendance, number of whales present and the number of days present. Also, the Chinook salmon abundance is another metric we could use to gauge whether or not this region still meets their needs. This is just a map. Let me go to the next one. Shows the coastal boundaries. We do keep track of sightings all over the area. The purple bars over there represent the number of sightings in the core summer habitat, but we also keep records on coastal, northern Strait of Georgia, Puget Sound, and other sightings. This is not meant to be a map that shows detailed movements through the area or fine-scale habitat use here. It's basically a map that shows one point for each day whales are sighted in any of the regions of interest. And this is rather sparse. I'll show you the transient map for the same time period later. This is a graph of the attendance patterns for this year, 2017. It spans from the 1st of May through September, but of course we don't know how the year is going to turn out at this point. The bars represent how many whales are here, and they're color-coded by pods. So in May, for example, we had J-pod, and L87 here on a few days, with J-pod being denoted by the blue bars. Later in June, we had J-pod with just the K14s. And then the green bars represent different combination of L-pod. You know, what's wrong with this picture? Well, all the white space there represents all of the whales who were somewhere else. And yet this is the core summer habitat for these whales. For those of you who remember 2013, this is looking remarkably similar to 2013. 2013 probably set a record low attendance for the whales in the area, at least during Ken's tenure here. And it's too soon to know how 2017 will compare to that. And just for comparison, this is the same graph for 2015. And a lot more presence there. Still sparse in May, but definitely picked up the rest of the year with J's, K's, and L's being seen here in rather large numbers. This is a different way of looking at attendance. This contrasts 2 years of interest. One is 2010 and the other one is 2013. This is just J-pod, and the time period of interest here is June. Sorry, I did it again. Is June through September. But the blue cells represent a day when J-pod, or at least part of J-pod, was here in the area, and all of the yellow cells highlight when J-pod was absent. But you can see they were absent on more days in 2013 by far and away than 2010. You're going to see a connection to the Fraser River salmon abundance in a little bit, so bear with me. This is another slice of J-pod attendance. This graph spans 2004 to 2017, and the months of interest are April through September, with each month color-coded. And then the stripe bars represent a new thing we're seeing in recent years, where only part of J-pod is coming in. It's splitting. And that makes it harder to track how many whales are here. We can no longer assume that if a few J-pod whales are seen, that the whole pod is here. And the same is true for K's and L's. But of note here is this decline since 2014. It's pretty pronounced, with 2013 being the anomaly. I also want you to remember this little bit of a variation here, this camel shape, so to speak, the hump, because you're going to see that again in the Fraser River numbers. This is attendance in May, just the month of May 2004 through 2017, with full scale here representing the whole month, or 1 day shy. But again, a steady decline in the month of May. So, Fraser River. A lot of people think of the Chinook salmon runs as being a single run, but in reality, for many of these river systems, there's spring, summer, fall runs. The Sacramento River in California is unique because it has hosted a winter run. It's been decimated, and one of the endangered runs. Like the Southern Residents, it's one of the eight most likely species to go extinct. Species in the Spotlight campaign. But the Fraser River has 2 spring aggregates, one with fish that return at 4 years of age and one at 5, and similarly 2 summer aggregates and 1 fall aggregate. If you've caught any of the white-fleshed salmon in this area, those are the Fraser River fish from the Harrison area of the Fraser River. It's actually a light pink, but it's called white. But in an ideal world, with the spring runs coming early in the year, the summers coming later, and the fall following, if these runs were strong and remain strong, these whales could have a steady diet in this area throughout this period. Well, this is what the abundance trends look like on the Fraser River in recent years. And this one goes back to 1988, and 2017, of course, isn't complete. But you can see a little bit of a trend here. These runs peaked in the mid-90s, which coincidentally or not, is when the southern resident population peaked. And it's been pretty much in decline since then. I had no idea myself this was going on until 2013 and started digging into why the whales weren't here that year. But it's also color-coded by season, with blue being spring, green being summer, and orange being fall. You know, these vanishing blue bars here over the years represent the spring run that's been decimated. You know, is it coincidence that the J-pod whales aren't coming here anymore in May? They have to go elsewhere to find food because we don't have food here for them anymore. Oh, also I mentioned that hump in the last couple of years. Look at this. It matches what the J-pod whales did in recent years. They were here in larger numbers on more days. This is another way to look at the Fraser River. This is a cumulative plot of the number of Chinook that are netted each day in the test fishery. And it's color-coded so that the years prior to 2005 are the light gray shades here. And then the rivers starting in 2005 have the color bands. Well, what's wrong with this picture? You know, nothing in recent history rivals what has happened in the past with the Fraser. This is where we sit right now in 2017, and here's an expanded version of it right here. But we're rivaling 2012, 2013, which were the two lowest years on record at the Fraser River. You know, we could see a surge in the summer and fall runs later, but we don't know how it's going to look. Coastwide Chinook abundance. This chart has been seen many times. It may have been my doing, but it was Ken's vision to build it. The first one took about 4 weeks, but it's been fairly easy to maintain since then. But the point I wanted to make here is behind the scenes, there are about 500 or 600 runs that either currently or have in the past supported Chinook runs. And they fall into 3 categories. Many of the wild runs are extinct or extirpated, and they've been pretty much swept under the rug. There's not much hope of reconstituting those runs, although efforts are being attempted in a few parts of the country, notably some of the California rivers. Many are endangered or threatened or species of concern. These are getting a lot of attention, and they are money pits. You know, hundreds of millions of dollars are being consumed and spent trying to resurrect these runs, and I'll show you an example of how that's going. But I often wonder if there isn't more hope for the whales in these remaining runs. Maybe this is where the low-hanging fruit would be found. You know, can anything be done for the Fraser River or the Trinity Spring run, some of these other ones, to boost the abundance now? Maybe it's easier to boost abundance now than to wait till they're in so much trouble that there isn't a lot of hope for them. So, this is the history of the Sacramento, California spring run. This goes back to the late 1800s, but the abundance has declined steadily for decades. And fishing was abolished here, but the run wasn't declared to be endangered until this time point here. 20 years later, we still don't have much to show for recovery. You know, the sobering news here is that for a lot of these runs that are threatened or endangered, meaningful recovery is probably not going to come in the lifespan of the whales that are alive today. It's a long time. And if you look at the history of a lot of the other California runs, it's the same thing. You know, the beginning of the habitat destruction started back with the gold rush, but we didn't know any better back then. And it stands to reason that if it takes 100 years to tear something apart, it's not going to be put back together overnight. This is the Columbia River. It's the Bonneville Dam counts. It's one way of looking at abundance of the Columbia runs. It's not a complete picture because the Bonneville Dam counts don't reflect the coastal harvest, they don't reflect the in-river harvest below the dam, and they don't include the fish that left the main stem to spawn in tributaries below the dam. But it's a long-running data set. I've got data just for 2010 through 2017. And this is the spring run. It's not a large run, but it was not so good in 2013, the same year the Fraser River was in trouble, and it wasn't a very strong run this year. The summer run, the data collection hasn't yet concluded. That will end in July. But it's not a big run. But in comparison, these are the fall runs in those same years. You know, you hear about massive runs on the Columbia River from time to time. When that happens, it's the fall runs. Now, this has implications for the whales. I think it all has implications for how to help them and where to put the focus, namely on spring and summer runs where you can find them. And to that point, this is a slice of coast-wide abundance chart through 2013 with the data grouped by the season, the run timing, spring Chinook salmon runs, and summer fall, and here's fall. This is kind of the trend coast-wide. Lots of runs in the fall with a lot of abundance on some of them and not so many runs for spring and summer feeding, and the abundance isn't as large. And this last chart is from the Pacific Salmon Commission document. They publish several documents every year on the state of Chinook in the region with emphasis on British Columbia, but it does include some U.S. data. But it's a Pacific Salmon Commission that manages the Pacific Salmon Treaty and sets the harvest quotas and all. But this is the Alaska Troll harvest in southeast Alaska with estimates of the origin of the Chinook that are being caught there. And that's based on some modeling, some coded wire tag data, and so on. But this little purple sliver at the bottom represents the fish that would have returned to natal rivers in southeast Alaska. All of these other fish, up to 300,000 in some years, belong to Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. So if you thought this was a sustainable harvest, that it was okay to buy and consume king Chinook from southeast Alaska, think again. This was an eye-opener. But I've been looking up and down the coast for about 500,000 fish for these whales. And there's quite a few here, but there's no way to know if this harvest could be suspended entirely. How many of those fish would get back here? Some of them would fall victim to other predators and die along the way, but it's still sobering how the fisheries is being managed. Transient Biggs killer whales. Okay, this is a happier story. So the transient population, the presence in this area is on the rise. These are the West Coast transients. This year brought a few Alaskan transients to the region. Never been seen in this area before as far as Jared Towers at DFO knows, and they don't even have West Coast designations yet. He'll have to assign some later. The status is threatened in Canada and not the same in the United States. Only the AT1 transients have a designation in the U.S., and they're depleted. These are the whales that were affected by the Exxon Valdez oil spill. It's important to note the role of Canada, the Canadian researchers in all of this. Just like the Center for Well Research has ownership of the southern resident population data and tracking that population, it's the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada that tracks the transient population. They track the births and the deaths, assign the designations, and also the movements throughout the area. And the center is really a supporting player in all of that. The center has been documenting the transient presence for as long as it's been in existence. To give you an idea of comparisons in presence, this is data for 2016, and it's for the period of April through September, and the graph is scaled so that 180 days represents the 6-month period. Southern residents were in the core summer habitat about half that time, with jays being the dominant presence here, and Ks and Ls only present about half as much time as the jays. If you expand the region to the Salish Sea, which includes Puget Sound and the western Strait of Juan de Fuca, southern residents were in that area about 110 days. But look at the transients. They were here nearly every day in that same time period. And this is a map of the transient sightings just this year. And it's intended to spot 1 point per day for each group that's come into the area. Okay, so to wrap things up, we talked about metrics. If the southern resident presence in the core summer habitat and the Fraser River Chinook salmon abundance are reasonable metrics of how well we're protecting this area for the whales, I don't think we're doing very well. Another lesson is that Chinook salmon recovery is a very slow and lengthy process. And last but not least, the transient presence this is a happy place for them, I think. But they're doing well. They're finding things to eat here and having lots of babies, unlike the southern residents.